Tehran has sharpened its tone even as diplomacy gathers pace, calling Washington's moves a search for a way out and sending two of the president's top envoys back to Islamabad in a gamble that the fragile pause in fighting can be turned into something more durable. In Tehran's account this week, the United States is searching for a face-saving exit from a conflict that, in Iran's telling, it has become trapped in. A spokesperson for Iran's defense ministry told state outlets, our military power today is a dominant force, and the enemy is looking for a face-saving way to escape the war quagmire it has become trapped in. Language that reflects both confidence in Iran's armed posture and a determination to frame any diplomatic momentum as the result of American pressure rather than Iranian concession. That message has been repeated across multiple Tehran channels in recent days. Show of strength, insistence on deterrence, and a refusal, at least publicly, to be hurried into a settlement, and on terms they consider unacceptable. The timing of those statements is notable. While Iranian officials publicly underscore their readiness and unused capacity, Washington has dispatched envoys to Islamabad for another round of talks that could decide whether the tenuous truce holds or frays. On the ground in Pakistan, Iran's lead diplomat arrived first. Abbas Araki, identified by Tehran as the foreign minister on this visit, landed in Islamabad and moved quickly into a set of meetings that included Pakistan's military leadership and senior government ministers. He met Pakistan's Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir and held consultations with Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif and Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar. Pakistan's decision to place both civilian and military officials at the table signaled that these discussions are not simply diplomatic formality, but strategic conversations about stabilizing a ceasefire that has so far been open-ended and fragile. Araki described his chief travels plainly, embarking on timely tour of Islamabad, Muscat, and Muscat. Purpose of my visit is to closely coordinate with our partners on bilateral matters and consult on regional developments. Our neighbors are our priority. That line, delivered in Tehran, underlines the regional sweep of Iran's approach, coordinating with neighboring states and seeking to shape the diplomatic space around the conflict rather than negotiating bilaterally under pressure from Washington. For the United States, the next chapter was dispatched from Washington. The president decided to send Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Presidential Advisor Jared Kushner to Islamabad to press negotiations forward. White House officials framed the move as an opportunity to listen, to test whether Tehran will re-engage in person, and to press for concrete commitments. As one senior administration official put it plainly at a briefing, well, look, as you know, and I spoke about it earlier this week, the president was flexible in granting an extension of the ceasefire throughout this time. The president has decided to dispatch Special Envoy Witkoff and Jared Kushner back to Islamabad. The Iranians want to talk. They want to talk in person. And so the president is, as I've said many, many times to all of you, always willing to give diplomacy a chance. So Steve and Jared will be heading to Pakistan tomorrow to hear the Iranians out. We hope progress will be made, and we hope that positive developments will come from this meeting, and we will see. And the president, the vice president, Secretary of State will be waiting here in the United States for updates, and the vice president, I understand, is on standby and will be willing to dispatch to Pakistan if we feel it's a necessary use of his time. That dispatch came after a first round of talks earlier this month, led at the time by the Vice President J.D. Vance, which ended without a breakthrough. According to U.S. officials, the first round left Kordai. Agreements unresolved, particularly over the naval blockade in the Gulf and the sequencing of concessions both sides would be required to make. Tehran demanded, among other things, an end to what it calls an unlawful naval blockade. Washington has insisted on verifiable long-term commitments from Iran on its nuclear program and on the non-proliferation measures it will accept. The result has been a classic diplomatic standoff. Movement on the calendar, envoys in planes, meetings scheduled are hoped for, but a messaging gap that is as consequential as any negotiation point. Tehran has repeatedly said it will not hold direct talks with U.S. officials, preferring instead to work through intermediaries, principally Pakistan. Pakistan officials, for their part, have stayed in the role of broker, shuttling messages and trying to keep both sides at the table. That intermediary role has given Islamabad leverage, but also exposed it to intense scrutiny as the optics of who shows up, who sits in the same room, and who relays what to whom can quickly shape the public narrative about who is conceding and who is standing firm. Security was tightened in Islamabad as news of Iraqi's arrival spread. Pakistani authorities moved to protect diplomatic venues and public facilities as officials weighed how best to host the next phase of talks. For Pakistan, the stakes are high. Since brokering the original two-week ceasefire in early April, Islamabad has been cast as the linchpin holding the fragile pause together. That status brings influence, but also heavy responsibility and the risk of being blamed by either side if talks collapse. Even as envoys moved, Tehran set firm boundaries. State media and spokespeople made clear that no direct engagement with American officials was planned on Iranian terms and that any contact would continue through Pakistan. Tasnim, a media outlet close to Iran's security establishment, published commentary asserting that Tehran would not sit in direct talks with Washington at this time. Those public refusals complicate Washington's hopes for face-to-face negotiations and suggest that Pakistan's mediating role would have to stretch further if any progress is to be made. Back in Washington, the president articulated a different focus. He cast diplomacy as the first option while also questioning Tehran's internal cohesion. Asked about the prospects for the talks and the nature of Iran's leadership, the president said, "Part of the problem is that that's why I can't really answer your question. They have all new leadership and they're fighting like cats and dogs for who's going to control because we've created a real mess for them. But they've created a mess for the world over the last 47 years. They've killed a lot of our people. We have been speaking to them, but they don't even know who's leading the country. They're in turmoil. So we thought we'd give them a little chance to get some of their turmoil resolved. We'll see what happens. We have no pressure. It's only guys like you with a question like that about what's your time. We've been doing it for 5.5 weeks. That assessment, part critique, part portrayal of Iran's disarray, is meant to frame Washington's negotiating posture as patient but resolute. U.S. officials insist their red lines are clear: a long-term Iranian commitment not to seek a nuclear weapon and constraints on the capabilities that would allow rapid breakout, as one U.S. official who spoke after the first round bluntly summarized. The administration needs to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon. From Tehran's perspective, those demands are part of a script that removes agency from Iranian negotiators and ties their hands. Iranian statements this week stress capability and readiness, even as they signaled an openness to discuss, but only on Iran's terms and through channels that preserve dignity and leverage. The Defense Ministry's insistence on deterrence and the repeated reference to unused capacity are intended for multiple audiences. Domestic insistence of the central practical obstacle in these talks remains the naval situation in the Gulf. Iran has called the American naval posture there a violation of the ceasefire, and Pakistan has told both sides it will push for arrangements that stabilize shipping lanes and keep the Strait of Hormuz from being a daily flashpoint for escalation. For global markets, the blockade's existence, even as a contested term, is enough to rattle energy prices and shipping insurance rates, underlining how quickly battlefield dynamics ripple into the global economy. The political choreography is as consequential as the substance. Who sits down with whom and where becomes a signal in this high GH stakes environment. Tehran's refusal to meet Washingtoners face-to-face in Islamabad creates a diplomatic asymmetry. Pakistan will brief the Americans on its consultations with Tehran rather than seeing both delegations in the same room. That arrangement may preserve plausible deniability and save Tehran the optics of a direct encounter, but it can also compound the messaging gap and prolong mistrust. And there is a human toll behind the maneuvering. Weeks of conflict have cost lives and displaced communities across the region for civilians in Iran, in neighboring states, and in areas where allied forces have been engaged. The ceasefire's extension has been a fragile and much-needed relief. Pakistan's mediation has bought breathing room for humanitarian work and allowed camps to stabilize, but the absence of a clear timeline or a binding agreement keeps local populations living with uncertainty. And Alassan's former officials watching the Islamabad track emphasizes practica el goal, to convert a pause into a durable de-escalation while creating a sequence for unavoidable compromises. For Washington, that sequence begins with verifiable commitments on nuclear constraints and on behaviors that threaten regional shipping. For Tehran, any agreement will need to lift immediate pressures, notably the contested naval posture, and ensure that Iranian security and dignity are recognized in a way that domestic audiences will accept. At the same time, the talks are a contest over narrative. Both sides are are vying to convince domestic and international audiences that they are negotiating from strength. Tehran's public messaging stresses readiness and deterrence. Washington underscores its red lines and the need for verifiable commitments. Pakistan, caught in the middle, must manage optics carefully, host the process without appearing to take ownership of an outcome that either side could later contest. If the talks in Islamabad produce movement, it may take the fore. Of incremental technical agreements, first confidence-building measures, steps to de-conflict naval operations, and mechanisms for verifying any commitments. If the diplomatic seams hold, Pakistan could claim a major piece of international diplomacy, converting a 2-week ceasefire into a longer-term roadmap for de-escalation. If they do not, both sides risk slipping back toward a cycle of tit-for-tat strikes and a wider regional conflagration. There is finally the question of timing and optics. With envoys arriving, declarations being made, and cameras watching every movement, neither side wants to be seen as the first to blink. That dynamic, which often produces the most durable diplomatic outcomes when one or both parties can save face, is precisely what Islamabad must manage. The space for compromise exists, but it will require careful sequencing, credible guarantees, and above all, patience. For now, Pakistan remains at the center of a high-stakes diplomatic gambit. The world will watch whether the envoys who have flown in and the mediators who arranged the ceasefire can translate a fragile pause into a sustainable halt to hostilities. In the coming days, what unfolds in Islamabad will help determine whether the rhetoric from Tehran about strength and deterrence becomes a backdrop for a negotiated settlement or whether it hardens into renewed confrontation. Outside negotiating rooms, the broader test will be whether leaders can convert posture into policy, whether declarations of readiness and deterrence can coexist with a credible, verifiable plan that reduces violence and protects civilian lives. At stake is nothing less than the durability of a ceasefire, the security of a volatile region, and whether diplomacy will be permitted to close the gap between opposing narratives before fighting resumes. The next hours and days in Islamabad are therefore about more than schedules and statements. They will be about sequencing, signals, and the hard choices that diplomats and commanders alike must make if a fragile truce is to become the first step toward a stable peace.